All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are on the turbulent 1960s. What we're going to talk about on this presentation is specifically civil rights. And so this fits into, in large measure, the 1960s, although an element of this begins in the 1950s, and we'll talk about this. So it is an era of protest. If you're taking this in association with my 1302 class, understand there's a lot of crossover between this and the turbulent 60s. In other words, civil rights is highly turbulent. A lot of this takes place during the 60s, and so there's a lot of crossover between the turbulent 60s and civil rights. We'll take a look at some of the major events. For those of you guys that are like seeing this on the YouTube, which is obviously that's where I put it, figure out how to do a screenshot and then print the screenshot, and then you could just follow along in your notes. Otherwise, you could just like watch the images, and cause this is largely print based, if you will, and you'll see that in the next two slides. And then the rest of it is all about images. So figure out how to do a screenshot, then print it if you can't get that printed for me in class. Then we'll take a look at some image analysis. That won't take very long at all. Again, it's just going over the images, showing you guys some of the things that are like going on at the time. So with that in mind, let's go to the next slide and talk about civil rights. So what's going on here? We're taking a look at civil rights. Now, this is not on there. It begins obviously with 1954, but there is some deep background I want you guys to know. If you recall, in the 1930s, the Depression was on and all these New Deal programs became available. But FDR kept getting letter after letter after letter after letter, really from white people, saying you have to help us first. That is to say, the white community. And that's how FDR was getting elected. And so he had to go with, his constituency, really. He understood that most people, African Americans in the South, they didn't have the vote because of Plessy v. Ferguson, because of Jim Crow laws, because of black codes. They didn't have the vote. So he really had to go with, helping white people first on the hopes that as the macroeconomy trended towards prosperity, the microeconomy of the African American community in the South would trend towards prosperity as well. Well, this is really unfair. And so one of the figures that emerges during that time is a guy named Bayard Rustin, and I'll have his picture up there in a few minutes. Bayard Rustin, B-A-Y-A-R-D, Rustin, R-U-S-T-I-N. Now, Bayard Rustin had been a long-time member of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and he was an organizer. He knew everyone. He really focused a lot of time and energy on trying to get equality and education. He's one of the civil rights people that's really, in large measure, forgotten, and I will talk about him a little bit later on, especially in the first part of the next slide, I think. No, I guess I'll talk about it in 57 when MLK becomes the leader of the SCLC. But I want you guys to understand that Bayard Rustin, he's this long-term member of the NAACP. He's been fighting for civil rights really since the 1930s. He knew everyone, and he's working really, really, really hard to advance the cause. Now, the reason why most of you guys didn't know him is he had to stay kind of in the background. He couldn't become a public figure. And the reason why, he was gay, he was homosexual. And of course, back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, that was like really a big taboo. You just could not do that. You could not be openly gay. And so to keep the movement from becoming discredited, he stayed behind the scenes. He stayed kind of, out of sight, but he was doing all the organization. He was doing all the groundwork. And so he should be really an individual. I think it's important for you guys to know who he is, Bayard Rustin. So the NAACP and the civil rights movement had been very active, really generating from the 1930s. And again, this is about FDR having to help the white population first. So what I want you guys to get out of that part of the background information is African Americans in the South, they got out of that message that FDR said, listen, I got to help everybody else first, that they have to help themselves, that they really have to be self-reliant. You're not really going to be really able to depend upon the Democratic Party. Now, during the war years, African Americans, as we've discussed in another venue, they really did step up, and they put forth a huge amount of effort, both in manufacturing, in the civil sector, and in the military. But I'm sorry to say, the African American community got nothing out of World War II. There was no meaningful recognition. There's no extension of any kind of rights or anything like that. So again, the African American community has to be self-reliant. They've got to, like, if they want to generate interest in their cause, which is civil rights, and if they want to be active in that, and if they want to obtain civil rights, they're going to have to do it themselves. So that puts us on the board here. With that kind of deep background in mind, that puts us on the board. 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Now again, civil rights as an event, as a major event, for those of you guys who are taking my 1302 class, this might rise to the level of an essay question. And to properly address a question of that nature, an essay question, just be prepared to write a few bullet points on every one of these major points on this page and the next page. So Brown v. Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. So the background on this, like any other Supreme Court case, the background is that the Brown family lived in Topeka, Kansas. And in Topeka, in Kansas, they had segregation. That had gone all the way back to, the era of Reconstruction. And so they had strong segregation. They had segregationist policies, and they said separate but equal. Well, then Plessy v. Ferguson came along in 1898, and that kind of institutionalized this idea, this policy of separate but equal. And the people of Kansas had, over the years, embraced that idea that there's going to be segregation between the people of the white race and people of the black race. And so there were black schools. Well, in this particular case, the Brown family lived in Topeka and just a few blocks away from the high school. But their children, obviously they were black, and so their children had to get on a bus and be taken way outside, miles and miles away, outside of Topeka, Kansas, to go to school there. And the facilities were substandard. It was cold in the winter, hot in the summer. And the teaching was substandard. They were getting a poor education. And the family kept saying, listen, we're paying our taxes. Now, the state of Kansas, along with many other states in the South, said, listen, what we're going to do is we're going to take the taxes paid by African Americans and put those into African American schools. Well, the problem there is that there's not enough African Americans for a meaningful tax base to support schools. And the African American population is economically, they're at the very bottom of the food chain. They're really way, way down low because of all these Jim Crow laws and black codes and for all these racist reasons. And so, the state of Kansas, along with many other southern states, are saying, oh, well, we're going to very kindly allow black people to pay for their own schools. And if you want to pay more for your schools, then you could do that. But there's not enough of them to be a meaningful tax base, and they're very poor, so they don't have much in the way of taxes. So, of course, the school then was substandard. So the Brown family said, listen, it's a tremendous inconvenience to us to have to send our child way out here to a substandard school way outside of Topeka just because they're black, and we are paying our taxes. Now, on the state of Kansas side, they said, listen, this has been put before the voters again and again and again. And the voters have all said, we want separation, we want separation, we want separation. They want separate but equal. And then equal, that's a very elastic phrase. But the state of Kansas said that's the law, that's within the state of Kansas, that's within our power, and we're going to have that. Now, please make a strong note here. Brown v. Board of Education is an umbrella case. And what I mean by that is there have been several other lawsuits before the Supreme Court that did the same thing. There were several other court cases throughout the southern states especially that were approaching the same issue, this separation leading to a substandard education. So the case, Brown v. Board of Education, which goes from 1954 through 55, This is an umbrella Supreme Court case that will also solve all of these other similar cases. Now, please write a strong note on this. When the case was submitted, the plaintiff, the Brown family, and their lawyers had gone to the trouble of getting all sorts of other psychological studies, and that is key to understanding this case. The Brown family got all these psychological studies, and all the psychological studies were unanimous. They all said that this stigma of going to this school just because you're black, this stigmatizes the student, and they understand that. Little kids are going to get that like really, really quickly. And they understand that they're being treated differently because they're black. Furthermore, they can't help but know that they're getting a poor education. Their education quality cannot help but be poorer. Because they're in a substandard school, they got terrible textbooks. The teachers are very, very few. And so you have, a very few teachers and a whole lot of students. So instructors are having to teach multi-grade levels. Well, this cannot help but have bad educational outcomes. And so these black students are stigmatized, and it affects them throughout the rest of their lives. That's what these studies showed. The study showed conclusively that stigmatizing these students on the basis of their skin color affects them, negatively impacts them for the entire rest of their lives. And that's unfair. That's unconstitutional. It lends credence to this idea that separable but equal. That's not working. That's like a really, really bad idea. Which, for those of you who've taken the rest of the class, you know that John Marshall Harlan, who'd been the Chief Justice in the Plessy v. Ferguson case, said that. He said that at the time. It's 1898 when Plessy v. Ferguson was fought. So the Brown family says, listen, we pay our taxes. We want our children to go to a better high school. And Topeka, Kansas, the state of Kansas says, no, we make the laws here in Kansas, and the voters have spoken, and that's what we're going to do. So it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sided with the Brown family. They cited all of these studies after studies after studies that showed that there's a lasting negative impact to segregation in the school system. So the big outcome on this, please write a strong note here. For those of you guys who have seen me in class, you know I'd be jumping up and down right now. This means that all of these Jim Crow laws, all of these black codes, especially the ones that have to do with education, are overturned, no matter what the state is, whether in Kansas or Louisiana or Mississippi or Florida or wherever, any one of these southern states, North and South Carolina, any one of them. All of those segregationist laws are struck down. The federal court has precedence here in that they are the Supreme Court. So all the lower courts and all the state courts, they have to go with what the Supreme Court said on this, and that is that these segregations, especially in education, is over with. So please, again, take a strong note here. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time said, this overturns Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferguson, this is part of the case, is overturned. No more separate but equal. That policy is dead. Plessy v. Ferguson is overturned. So the reason why I put this up here in 1954 and really going into the 1955 is that this is the true, in my view, this is the true beginnings of the civil rights movement. When separate but equal is overturned, Plessy v. Ferguson is overturned, this is the turning point. This is the beginning of the civil rights movement. So the law no longer supports this segregationist policies. Segregationist laws and segregationist policies are a dead letter. You can't have that anymore. So with that, let's go to 1955. Rosa Parks. Now I have her picture down below. If you want to press pause right now and go skip down to, I sort of have a photo montage of her down below. That's fine. Come back to this. So in Montgomery, Alabama, they had a segregationist public transportation system. And the way it worked was the driver of the bus had a sort of a sign. And it was on a little pedestal thing, and as the bus went through its route, the sign said, Black people only after the sign. White people could sit in front of the sign, but black people had to sit behind the sign. And as the bus went through its route and more people got on, the bus driver would see that the seats were filling up and would take the sign and move it farther back in the bus so that white people had more places to sit. Now, please understand that the way this worked is pernicious. It's it affects a lot of people, and it's like it's very pernicious. It's very, very negative. And here's the reason why I say that. Assume that you're a black person. You get on the bus at the first part of its route, and you want to go through, way down the route. You've got a long ways to go to get home. You get on the bus, and your ticket gets punched. Then you take a seat behind the sign. You're African American. You have to sit behind the sign. Well, then more people get on the bus, and the driver gets up and moves the sign. Well, if you're quick, you're going to be able to get behind the sign. But if you're not, then you have to get all the way off of the bus and re-enter in the rear of the bus. Well, there's a reason for this. Your ticket has already been punched now. So if you get off the bus and there's no place for you in the rear of the bus, then you are left at the bus station. You're left at that bus stop. And you have to wait for the next bus to come along. Well, if it so happens to be full of white people, if it's already loaded, then you can't get on board. So you have to wait for the next bus to come to your bus stop where you're at. But your ticket's already been punched. So there's a possibility that when you get on the bus, you have to pay. And you can say, well, now listen, I got kicked off the bus because I'm black earlier on and it got overloaded with white people. But the bus driver's going to say, well, you got to pay anyway because your ticket's already been punched. So, again, think this all the way through. During a busy time of the day, you might have gone on the bus at the beginning of the route, and then you're halfway through the route, you got kicked off the bus because there's no more spaces for you, and you wait for 2 or 3 buses to come by. They're all loaded, too, because of the busy time of the day. And it might be, late in the afternoon, late in the evening, before you finally find a bus that has a seat for you. And then you can continue on with the route. So when I say this is pernicious, that's what I mean. That this thing it has this terrible negative impact on all the patrons of the bus system. Now, today, we would say, listen, I bought my ticket, you punched my ticket, I get to sit anywhere I please, and you can't kick me off the bus until I decide to get off. And that's it. But that's not the way it was then. So with that information in mind, let's talk about Rosa Parks. Now, Rosa Parks, she gets on the bus, and she's subjected to this. She was hardworking. She was coming home from her job. She was a tailor, a seamstress. She gets on the bus, and all she was thinking, she talked about this a lot, all she was thinking about is getting home and getting a meal going for her family. Her husband was on his way home. The kids were coming home from school, and all she could think of was getting home and getting a meal for her family. Well, the bus driver came along and said, I'm sorry, you've got to move to the back. And she said, no, I'm not going to move. Now, to his everlasting credit, and I can't think of the guy's name right off the top of my head. You can look it up if you want. It's not material here. The bus driver said, listen, I don't like this policy either. He was white, but he didn't like the policy. He said, but if you don't move, I got to call the cops. You got to move. And Rosa Parks talked about this, and the more she thought about it, the more she got upset about this. And she said, no, I'm not going to move. Either drive on or call the cops. Make up your mind. Well, again, the bus driver said, listen, I don't want to lose my job. Please move. And she said no. She insisted. So the cops were called, and she was arrested. Strong note here. The NAACP was looking for a test case. In other words, the previous year, Brown v. Board of Education had gotten rid of this separate but equal policy. And so you could not do that. You had to desegregate the bus system. That's what the law said. All these segregationist laws, these Jim Crow laws and black laws, they were dead. So the NAACP was looking for a test case. And there'd been several others, but there was always something wrong with the individual involved. I seem to recall that there was one case where a young lady was pregnant. She was black and she was pregnant. Well, they wanted to try to, that was kind of, they were looking at that as a test case, but she was pregnant out of wedlock. And in the 50s, that was like a really bad deal. Another was some individual, but he had a criminal record. He was an alcoholic, whatever the problem was. But when Rosa Parks got on there, again, strong note here, when Rosa Parks got on there, her husband had a good paying job. He was doing okay. Their kids were not in trouble. They were doing good in school. They were getting good grades. She was clean cut. They were the all-American family. And so for no other reason than the fact that she was of African American heritage, she was being maltreated. And so, again, I'll cover this when I talk about the image analysis. You'll see that she's coming across as a clean cut, polite. She just wants to go home. And yet she's being maltreated. And again, that's what I mean with this phrase. When I say this phrase, pernicious, that's what I mean. This thing is like, it's so invasive. So with that in mind, let's go to 1957. And Dr. Martin Luther King leads the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Now, Dr. King had been an activist. He had gone to divinity school. It's Dr. Martin Luther King. He had a PhD in divinity. He had been a very vocal advocate of civil rights. Later on, when we talk about the Birmingham County Jail, the letter from the Birmingham County Jail, he articulates his point of view on that in very, very excellent terms, better than I could ever do. And so we'll let that leader speak for himself. But there's a couple of things I want you to know about this, just a couple of quick bullet points. Number one, it's Bayard Rustin who's really helping out Dr. King. Bayard Rustin has all the connections. He knows all the people. He knows, how to approach this thing, how to get meetings going. He knows everybody within the civil rights movement, the NAACP and the civil rights movement. He knows them all. And so he can make up the calls. He can do all of the administrative material that Dr. King needs to actually be kind of the front man. And, Dr. King, he made he had an excellent speaking voice. He was brilliant. He was very thoughtful and not provocative. He's not being provocative here. He's just saying, listen, and this is what the movement says. We are ordinary citizens of the United States, and that's all we want. We only want to be treated like ordinary citizens of the United States. We want to have the same thing that anybody else would have. Now, a long time ago, a little personal story, back in the day, I was this, kid in from the farm, and I lived in an all-white community, basically. It's just the nature of it. But then I was in the military. And I don't recall now, but there was something going on with civil rights. And I asked one of my non-commissioned officers, who was, he was African American, a really good guy. Robinson was his name. And I said, Sergeant Robinson, what makes Martin Luther King, really special? And he said, listen, Martin Luther King was for everyone. If you were being identified as a minority group and put under special legal constraint, if your civil rights were being trod upon, he was for you. He's not like some civil rights leader who were only for African Americans. He was for anybody who was being maltreated by the system. Now, I mentioned there are two things that I want you guys to know about Martin Luther King, and number one was Bayard Rustin was helping. Number two, they insist on nonviolence. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the NAACP and the civil rights movement as a whole insist on nonviolence. They absolutely will not put up with any kind of militancy, and they're going to have nonviolence. So please make sure that gets in your notes. The Little Rock Nine, if I can just say it, the Little Rock Nine. Okay. So again, the setting of this is Brown v. Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. Well, Little Rock High School was a modern high school at the time. 1957, it's beautiful. It's still the high school today. And if you ever see it, it's manicured. There are trees and, everything is just beautiful. It's a lovely high school. And the people of Little Rock, the African American community in Little Rock, their out there. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're paying their taxes. They're working very hard. They're part of the community. And under the law, their taxes in Arkansas, their taxes have to go into the general tax budget. But Arkansas had said, you know, the people of Arkansas want segregation. They'd insist upon that. So the African American community in Little Rock said, no, we want our kids to go to this, you know, brand new, beautiful high school where they can get a positive education, where they can get a good education. And the governor and the school board and the superintendent were like, no, 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 we're not going to do that. Well, Eisenhower got involved in this, and he said, listen, I don't want there to be any troubles. And so you're going to let these little kids go there to that school. He contacted the governor. And the governor was kind of vague about this, and he said, okay, I'll call out the Arkansas National Guard to keep the peace. Please write that down. The governor of Arkansas told Eisenhower, I'll call out the National Guard to, quote, keep the peace. And this was highly deceptive. Eisenhower thought, okay, this governor's going to let those kids go to school. But the governor, as it turns out, was going to use the National Guard to make sure that these kids did not go to that school, that they were prevented. And so sure enough, when the school year started and this segregationist policy was dead, these children tried to go to school there at Little Rock High School. And they were prevented by the governor, by, you know, state police, and by the Arkansas National Guard. Well, Eisenhower found out about this, obviously, because it was in all the news, and he was livid. He was absolutely furious. First, he said this policy is dead, and he didn't like that policy under any circumstances. Second, he knew that this governor had deliberately, knowingly deceived him. And so Eisenhower took steps, and he sent down the 82nd Airborne to get these kids into school. And so there are photographs of them, and you can see them below, and we will go over those. Of the United States 82nd Airborne Division of the United States Army, in helmets, highly spit-shine shoes, pressed uniforms, rifles with fixed bayonets. I will say that part again. Rifles with fixed bayonets. Escorting these kids to school, picking them up in Army vehicles, driving them to school, forming a little formation around these children, marching them up the steps of the school, standing guard outside their classrooms. When it's over with, marching them out of there, putting them back into a car, and taking them out of there. So the actual Army had to go enforce the law. Segregation is illegal. It's unconstitutional. You can't do that. And the enforcement of these segregationist laws is also unconstitutional. You can't do that. So the South is like resisting this. Please take a strong note here. It is not the African American community that is agitating or becoming violent or reacting strongly. They only want what any ordinary American should be able to get. Strong note, it is the white community that is reacting negatively. It's the white community that's resisting this. They're the ones that are starting the riot. They're the ones that are doing all the yelling. The violence doesn't come from the African American community. They insisted on nonviolence. The violence is coming from the white community. So, 1960, 1961, the movement insists on nonviolence. Now, this becomes very, very widespread. Everybody says, okay, things are getting hotter and hotter. But the African American community in the South, the NAACP, the entire civil rights movement, they insist on nonviolence. So, a few broader issues that happened in 60-61, Woolworth sit-ins. Now, Woolworths, as far as I know, doesn't even exist today. But back in the day, and when I was a little kid, there was a Woolworths in our town. It essentially fit the same economic niche as Dollar General or Dollar Tree or something like that. Really kind of low-end department store shopping. They'd have a little bit of clothes, stationery, dishes. There was a little toys in there. There were a few toys for kids. Just little stuff like that. There was another one called Ben Franklin's, but the thing that was important about Woolworths is that they had a little food bar, and you can go in there and get a soda pop, maybe some ice cream, a hot dog, or a hamburger. Just a little fast order and short order place to eat. Well, in the North, and as it turns out, Woolworths was overseas as well, but in the North, anybody could sit down at the bar and get any food that that was on the menu. Anybody could. African American, white, Jewish, anybody could sit at the bar and get food. But in the South, Woolworths said, no, we're going to go along with the policy in the South, and African Americans can get food there, but only to take away. Except in some states where they couldn't even get food there. But under any circumstances, African Americans could not sit at the bar. So they could not sit at they just had little bench seats, and they had kind of a cafe sitting. So what's going on here? White activists in the South who were against segregation, and they did exist, they would invite their African American friends to go to Woolworths and sit down and eat. And they'd go in and sit down. Listen to me carefully. In other words, there has to be a pattern on this. The white kids or the white people would order for their guest the African American person. They would turn to the African American guy, the African American girl, and say, listen, what is it that you want? What would you like to eat? Okay, I'll have a cheeseburger and French fries and a cola. Okay, fine. Then when the waitress would show up, they're standing right there. Listen, I'll have, a cheeseburger and a French fry and a Coke, and my friend will have the same thing. And the waitress would have to say, you can have whatever you want, but they have to take their food and go, or, alternatively, they can't eat here. Well, the next step then, for these civil rights workers who are doing this, is saying, I'm going to stay right here until I get service. And that takes up valuable bar space, and they won't, well, I'm going to stay right here until I get service for my friend. This person is my guest. That was key to understanding how this works. Okay, so the problem becomes when white kids, and especially Klansmen, find out about this. And they find out that people are going to Woolworths and putting Woolworths under a lot of pressure, drawing a lot of attention to this continuing segregation. Well, the white kids will show up and start harassing the African American kids, start harassing the white kids that are helping the African Americans who are in the civil rights movement. And they'll take off the salt dispenser and pour it over people's head. And they'll take the little mustard or ketchup dispenser and squirt it all over them. And maltreat them and verbally abuse them and create this big giant scene. And so that went on and on and on until Woolworths finally, they caved in and said, you know what, just serve anybody. Because this was like spectacularly bad advertisement for Woolworths and made Woolworths seem like a racist organization. And so that worked. They caved in. Freedom Riders, the thing on this was that the bus system, and I mean the interstate bus system. The big one, of course, is Greyhound. I think they're still in service. Bluebird is another example. And they were interstate. Well, when they would go to the other states, Arizona or California or New York or Massachusetts or whatever, then the seating was not segregated. African Americans could sit wherever they wanted. But as soon as they went into the South, these interstate bus systems said, no, the policy in the South is, if you're African American, you've got to sit in the back. Well, you know what? I bought my ticket. If I was in Kentucky, I could sit anywhere I wanted, or Ohio or Indiana. But as soon as I get into the South, Tennessee or Alabama or someplace, then I got to change my seat. I got to sit in the back. I do not like that. So these Freedom Riders, the way they would work it is they would commute, they would carpool or get their own buses and go to the bus station and then buy up all the tickets. The white individuals in the civil rights movement, the white Freedom Riders, would get on the bus first and sit all the way in the back. Or if the seating was numbered, get the numbered seats that are all the way in the back of the bus. And then the black kids, the black civil rights workers, would be compelled to sit in the front. Well, there you are in Alabama or Mississippi or Louisiana or one of these other segregationist states, Georgia, North or South Carolina. And so the bus driver would say, well, no, listen, you guys got to change it around. And what would the civil rights workers say? No, we're not going to do that. This is my seat. I'm sitting all the way in the back of the bus. And so those black kids are compelled to sit in the front. And it went on like that. Now, again, the Klan finds out about this, and they try to chase these people down and chase them away and, destroy their carpooling. Some of these freedom riders had managed to get themselves their own bus so they could go from location to location, get off of their bus, go get a Greyhound or a Bluebird or some other bus, and then take that. Well, the Klan finds out about this and destroys their transportation. So the Klan is like really, really strongly reacted to this. Again, it's not the black population that's doing things like really negatively. They're not the ones that are like protesting violently. It's the white population. So James Meredith enrolls at Mississippi State, and there are riots there. Now, back in those days, you could do everything by mail, and this is what happens. So James Meredith went to a high school. He did good, had very good grades. And through the mail system, he sent in all of his paperwork and enrolled at Mississippi State University, which was an all-white college at the time, an all-white university. Well, Mississippi State did not really understand what was going on, and they sent back a letter of acceptance. They said, yes, you've got good grades, you're at the top of your class, everything else is fine, so you're in. Well, of course, James Meredith showed up at school, and they said, well, yeah, there's a problem now. Now that you're here and we can actually see you're black and you can't go to school here. Well, he said, no, I have a letter of acceptance. I'm already in. I've already signed up for the classes and I'm going. And, Mississippi State, they were stuck. They were stuck. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is what they did to solve it. In the classrooms where Mr. Meredith was going to actual class, they moved in a sort of a mobile sort of partition, a little frame with like a cloth cover on it, and put him on one side of that, and then the rest of the students on the other. So here's James Meredith sitting over on one side of the class with this little partition right next to him and his little desk, and here's the whole rest of the class on the other side of this little partition, so that he was separated away from them within the class. And so can you imagine the instructor, going around and going on the other side of the partition? Okay, Mr. Meredith, here's the information. Can you see the board okay? And then talking to the rest of the class? It's ridiculous. And there are pictures of that. I don't happen to have them here, but there are pictures of that. And so this is very embarrassing. And of course, the press gets control of that. They find out about this, and more about that later. But Mississippi State, they say, okay, well, they're stuck, and that's how they became desegregated. And Mississippi State is, generally speaking, in broad terms, there's more of an African American population than a white population in Mississippi State University today, and so they're much more fully integrated. But before this, before 1960-61, it was all white. African-American children could not go to that university. They couldn't go. So, again, the whole point here is it's really hard to understand how pernicious, how terrible this segregationist policy was for African-Americans in the South. And, again, I've mentioned this before. Let me mention it again right now. All they're saying is they're citizens of the United States. And they want the same rights, they want the same privileges, they want the same capabilities as any other citizen. They don't want anything special. African Americans don't want to be treated in some special way. They just want what everybody else gets. Well, I don't see what the problem with that is. So the next one, we're going into 60-61. White reaction forces Kennedy to send 5,000 troops to restore order. And he lends a lot of verbal and vocal support to the civil rights movement. And he kept saying that to his everlasting credit. He kept saying that. He met with Martin Luther King. He kept saying, listen, the civil rights movement, that's something we're behind. And so finally, The Democratic Party, Truman had done this to a certain degree, but the Democratic Party are signaling to the African American community, the Democratic Party is for you. Now, this is really unfortunate for the Republican Party because it sort of stigmatizes them as against the African American community. Now, that's unfortunate. But the Democratic Party is saying, yes, if you're African American, we're on your side. If you're Hispanic, this will emerge later on in the 1960s. If you're Hispanic, we're on your side. If you're a minority and you're being maltreated, the Democratic Party is trying to suggest, they're trying to signal that they're on your side. And again, this is, good on them. I would rather that every politician, no matter what their party, would be for minority groups. But it sort of suggests that the Republican Party, they're not going to do that. And that's genuinely unfortunate. So with that in mind, let's go on to the next slide. Again, there's a whole lot of verbiage on it, and we'll just go point by point. So 1963, Martin Luther King is arrested, and he writes the letter from the Birmingham Jail. Now, Martin Luther King had been publicly speaking, and he was arrested for that. And the charges are always very harassing. It's not just this one. He's arrested in half a dozen other places. And these charges are it's just about harassment. Just picking him up on basically no charges at all. Now, this is a direct violation of the Constitution. You have a right to public assembly. You have a right to that. And this is a direct violation of that. But Martin Luther King is becoming very powerful in the civil rights movement of the South, especially the Klan, which is thick in the South at this time. They recognize that, and so they begin to harass Martin Luther King. And while he was in jail, he sat down and wrote Letter from Birmingham Jail. Again, if you want to scroll down to one of the next slides, I think it's like 2 or 3 slides down, there's actually a couple of pictures of the letter from the Birmingham Jail. But very briefly on this, ladies and gentlemen, the letter from the Birmingham Jail, what it does is identifies the goals and the true meaning of the civil rights movement. Now, the setting of it, obviously, is that Martin Luther King is in jail. I have a picture of the jail cell down below. And he wrote in the letter, he said, listen, here I am sitting in this jail cell. And I thought that I would catch up on some correspondence to people who were writing letters to me. Then he specifies a little bit. He said, listen, letters that I get letters all the time that are nothing but hate mail. I get that a lot. That's what he said in his letter, in the letter from the Birmingham Jail. He said, and I ignore that. I put that, I throw that away. It's gone. I ignore that. But he pointed out that he's starting to get letters from other religious leaders, other congregational leaders, other leaders of, the Southern Baptist Church. There are other religious leaders, and they are talking to him. And they're saying, dial it back, just be patient. These things will come. And why are you doing this? And what do you hope to achieve? And they're really, and he kind of indicates this. He doesn't say it, but he indicates it. They're quite negative. These letters that he's getting from other religious leaders. So he said in the letter from the Birmingham Jail that he's going to respond to those. And I urge every one of you, please read the letter from the Birmingham Jail. It runs like 5 or 6 pages. He was looking throughout all of his coat pockets and his jacket pockets for any kind of stationery that he had. And he had some odds and ends stationery, bits and pieces of paper. And he just wrote out the entire letter. And what he says is, listen, we're just trying to achieve what every other American has. African Americans are paying their taxes. They're working hard. They've been waiting for, some sort of equality in America to achieve the American dream. And he says they've been waiting since the Civil War, 100 years before. They've been waiting and waiting and waiting for the law to catch up with, treating African Americans fairly and equitably. And so his question becomes kind of rhetorical. How long exactly are we supposed to wait? What key event would change the law around unless we take action and do that? Now, because he's addressing the letter to religious leaders, He makes some biblical references. He suggests, listen, our Savior in Christ, Jesus, was in his own way an activist. And why don't we emulate him? He was for the downtrodden. He was for people who had no hope. Well, why don't we emulate that? Instead of criticizing the movement, this is what Martin Luther King is implying, instead of criticizing the movement, why don't you help? Why aren't you on our side? Here are people who are being systematically maltreated. You are charged by Christianity to aid them, to help them. And he said, that's all I'm trying to do. I don't want special treatment. He says that. I don't want anything above and beyond. I don't want that. No one does, which was true. But he wants African Americans to be treated like any other people. So again, I urge every one of you to read the letter from the Birmingham Jail. And here's the reason why. Imagine, if you will, being arrested, not knowing what your immediate future is going to be, assuming you're going to have to pay a lot of money for a lawyer to get out of the can. You're in this terrible, terrible jail cell. Take a look at the picture down below. It's horrible. And you get out some stationery, and then you write this piece of amazing American prose. It's amazing. It's a well-thought-out letter. I mean, he clearly had these ideas in his mind, and he articulates these ideas and ideals of the civil rights movement. And in my view, it should be required reading for everyone in America. When you're under pressure and you're able to do that, that's an amazing piece of work just by itself. So with that, let's move on to the televised suppression of the riots. Now, here is a key event. I want you guys, please write strong notes here. What happens is the media, they start to get, they get caught on fire a little bit on this. They start to understand, the media begins to understand what's really going on. And so when media outlets find out that there's going to be a meeting or some other civil rights cause, some sort of civil rights activist cause, they try to put the televisions down there. Now, I cannot overemphasize this. Today, we wouldn't think anything of it because everybody has cameras. Probably the camera that you guys have on your devices is probably a high-speed, a high-resolution camera. But for a television camera back in those days, it was as big as a giant suitcase. And the television guy, the guy on television carrying the camera, he had to have this big backpack on for these enormous batteries to run it. And so these were large, bulky pieces of equipment. They're very heavy. The sound man has to be a separate guy with a big, giant battery pack on him. He has to carry this big, giant boom mic sound recording device. And so when we talk about television getting in on, the civil rights movement and televising all this stuff, please understand that was like a big, big deal. It's very, very difficult to actually do. So what they start filming, though, is, again, the dogs are cut loose, the fire hoses are cut loose. And what does it show? It shows African Americans standing on a street corner, maybe with some protest sign in their hands, in their Sunday clothes, just gathering and saying, listen, please stop, being violent towards us. Please, let us go to school. Please let us eat where we want to eat. And the cops show up. They got the billy clubs out. They start bashing some heads together. The fire department was there. They turn on the fire hose and said, disperse. You've been ordered by the mayor, who's probably a Klansman, to disperse, and they turn the fire hose on them right away. They get the big German shepherds, and they get the German shepherd dogs all riled up. Okay, go bite him, and the dogs are like ripping people up. And so you can see on this bullet point, I have the arrow, raises awareness nationwide. That is the critical event. That's the critical element here. This video, this television newsreels are shown nationwide. In other words, people throughout the rest of the nation assumed that it was African Americans in the South who were agitating, who were creating all the ruckus. But then when they actually see what's going on, they find that African Americans are really being quite passive. And they're being aggressed upon by white people. It's not the black people that are creating the ruckus. They're saying, listen, we just want to go to school. We want to get some food. We don't want people beating the crap out of us. And they're getting the fire hoses and the billy clubs. And so that changes everything. That changes a lot. So the next bullet point, 200,000 march on Washington, and Martin Luther King delivers the I Have a Dream speech. And again, you can YouTube this anytime you want. But the I Have a Dream speech is the same as all of his other speeches, the letter from the Birmingham Jail, and the message of the NAACP and the entire civil rights movement. African Americans only want to be treated like other citizens. They don't want anything special. He says, I have a dream that black children and white children can go to school together one day. Many of you guys enjoy that, that dynamic today in class. And you don't think anything of it. But just, 30, 40 years ago, that would have been highly controversial. As I'm talking about this, I'm in Texas, and I'm telling you right now, that would have been extremely controversial in Texas back in those days. Just not even a thing. So that's what the I Have a Dream speech is all about. African Americans just want to be treated like any other group of Americans. The next bullet point, murders at 16th Street Church. Now this is a horrible, horrible event. It's monstrous. There was church services going on at 16th Street Church in Selma, Alabama. And the children of the congregation were down in the basement. They were like, they had a little kind of a room down there where they could like play and do their Sunday school thing. Some Klansmen came along and bombed the place, threw a bomb, kicked in the basement window, and threw a bomb in, a firebomb. Well, here is the problem, ladies and gentlemen. 16th Street Church had been the target of Klan activity before. And so the people of the church understood that they had to call law enforcement immediately. They knew that they were the targets. They'd been subject to this sort of thing before. And so immediately they called law enforcement. Well, one of the cops that was on duty said, okay, I'll be right over. This bomb went off. Yeah, I'll get there, I'll be right over. Now, this is actually on a recording that the police department took of, like they would do today. And so the guy said, the cop said, okay, I'll go over there right away. Well, instead he went back to the police station, ate lunch, and then went over there, giving the Klansmen who did this plenty of time to get away. They didn't have to run away. They could just get in their car and drive away. They could just walk right down the street. They got away. Now, 4 little girls died here. And these young ladies there was no other crime other than being black. That was the problem, evidently. And so the Klan had done this to intimidate the African American community. That's all it was. One of the little girls, her sister, she was terrible burns, really badly wounded, and had lost an eye through this. But of course, even worse, she lost her sister, who basically was burned to death. Nobody deserved to burn to death. Here were these innocent little children playing around the basement of a church, and they were brutally murdered. Now, by this time, Lyndon Johnson is getting really, really mad about this sort of thing. And so there was an investigation. And the NAACP was starting to watch very closely. And there was the Attorney General at the time was Robert F. Kennedy. And he was watching very closely. Well, the prosecuting attorney, as it turns out, was a Klansman. And he knew all the rest of these guys who were going to be accused of this. There were 9 or 10 of them. So he knew he had to get some of them. They had to be guilty. And then the other ones, he was going to make sure they got away with it. So 2 or 3 were guilty, and then 2 or 3 got away with it. They were acquitted, and the rest of them got really low prison sentences. So I think the highest prison sentence was 6 years for a quadruple murder, a premeditated homicide, and they got less than 6 years in time served. And so it's horrifying. It's horrifying. The next one that's up there, NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers. He's murdered. Now, Medgar Evers he was in the South. He'd been repeatedly referred to with the N-word. He was subject to that sort of conduct all the time. And, as a young man, he said, okay, listen, I'm going to go to college. I'm going to get a better education. He did. And he's going to work in the South for civil rights. He married well. His wife was a concert pianist. She was really, really good, super highly educated. They started having children, and he was trying to have a middle class income life. That's all he wanted. Well, he becomes the field secretary for, I believe, Mississippi, and that made him the target of the Ku Klux Klan. And in point of fact, the Grand Dragon or Lizard or whatever they call themselves said, listen, we're going to murder this guy. He made that public statement. We're going to go after this guy, and we're trying to get him killed. So sure enough, he went to a meeting one night. His wife had said, listen, you need to give this job up because I don't want you to die. We got 3 kids. And he said, no, I'm dedicated to doing what I need to do. Well, he went to a meeting. The meeting broke up, and, he went home, and he's on his way into his wife and children. And 3 shots rang out. Boom, boom, boom. And so he was literally killed on the doorstep of his home. Basically right in front of his wife and children. For no other reason than being black. Now, there was some arrests were made, but basically they got off the hook. They were either acquitted or, the prosecuting attorney just couldn't find enough evidence. I think it was in 1988 or either 1989, a new prosecuting attorney said, listen, I'm going to reopen this case. And he looked at all of the information in the case file and said, there's enough evidence here to convict. So they went out and got the guy who did it and convicted him of capital murder. Now, it's horrifying, but it's true. The guy said, well, I'm really glad you guys are arresting me now and putting me in jail because I got cancer and I got all these other diseases. And since I'm going to be in jail, the state of Mississippi has to pay for every bit of that. They have to pay for all my health care. Awesome. So he was unrepentant after all these years. Understand that Medgar Evers, for no other reason for being black and trying to stand up for the rights of African Americans, was murdered. And his wife and his children were deprived of him all of those years. And at the same time, this guy who actually committed the murder shot him 3 times, point blank range with a rifle. Got away with it. Lived an ordinary life his entire life until he's almost 90 years old. And that's the sort of thing that's going on in the South. That's horrible. So the Civil Rights Act is signed by LBJ. Now, we're running out of time here because this has already run over an hour. Please look that up in your textbook. Please look up Civil Rights Act signed by LBJ. Look that up in your textbook. But what it basically says is you may not identify a minority group and put them under special legal constraint, which is what the Constitution implies already. You can't do that. It's unconstitutional. But he's saying the states can no longer have poll taxes. They can't have mechanisms to take rights away from African Americans. Now, again, think this all the way through. Brown v. Board of Education was 10 years before. And under the Constitution, that should have gotten rid of all those Jim Crow laws and segregationist laws and black codes. But it took another 10 years of legislation and fighting and, all this activism to actually get a Civil Rights Act that will aid African Americans, along with anybody else that's being put under some sort of discrimination. What the southern states were doing, you can't do that. It was illegal, but they were still doing it. So that's when we had to have the Civil Rights Act. Again, for the provisions of it, please look that up in your textbook. Later on in 1964, the Klan murders 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi. Now, this is called Mississippi Burning. The FBI case file was called MIBURN, or MIBURN, MIBURN, M-I-B-U-R-N. And that's what's short for a contraction of Mississippi Burning. Later on, I guess a few years ago, it's been about 10 or 12 years ago, there's a movie about this. I haven't seen the movie, but I understand it really does capture what's going on. So, the story on this, and I have a photo montage of this down below. There were 3 civil rights workers who were 2 white men and 1 black man who were working on civil rights in the South. They'd gone to a series of training programs in the North, and they were returning home to the South in Mississippi. Well, a policeman who was also a Klansman was kind of on the lookout for them and spotted them. So, for no evident reason, arrested them, pulled them over, and arrested them. Now, the charge was there'd been a church burning a couple of weeks before, and so this policeman, who is a Klansman, arrested him and said, "Yeah, you're involved in that church burning." Well, of course they weren't. They're the very ones that are trying to get away from that sort of thing, protesting against it. So they weren't allowed any telephone calls or anything like that. They stayed in jail for, several hours. And in the meantime, what this policeman, this Klansman, is doing is calling up all of his Klan buddies. Say, "Hey, listen, I got these guys. Get ready to take action." So finally, after several hours, these individuals were cut loose. Now, one of them called other people within the civil rights movement and said, "Listen, we're in this town. Here's what's going on. Keep an eye out for us. We're going to try and get in our car and get the heck out of here and escape because we're afraid something bad's going to happen." And sure enough, they got in their car, drove away a few miles. They were pulled over again, stopped, taken out of their car, put evidently into a police car, driven off, shot, and buried. Again, it's a terrible photograph, but I believe I have that photograph down below in the photo montage. It's horrible. They were buried. Then the perpetrators, these Klansmen, burned the car to destroy the evidence. Now, I have on there, LBJ launches a federal investigation. Strong note here. Now, the head of the FBI at that time was J. Edgar Hoover. The head of the FBI at the time was J. Edgar Hoover. And J. Edgar Hoover, he was not a racist. He wasn't a white supremacist. But he had managed to convince himself that it was African Americans who were creating all the ruckus, that they were the ones that were creating all the problems. Well, this showed that it was the Klan. This is the event that turned J. Edgar Hoover around, because the Klan were invading the police department. And one thing J. Edgar Hoover would not put up with was police corruption. He believed in the law. He believed in law enforcement. He believed law enforcement ought to be clean, spectacularly clean, that they should be above any kind of reproach. And when the investigation showed that law enforcement was actually involved in the murders, actively involved in the murders, then he's like, "Okay, we got to turn this around." And so then the FBI, now listen, this is a turning point. Then the FBI begins to investigate all these murders, all these bombings. They begin to put the Klan under a lot of pressure of investigation. The FBI is putting agents down the South. They open up new agencies down the South to suppress the Klan. And so everybody who is a Klansman in the South, which was almost all of law enforcement, and many prosecuting attorneys and judges, a lot of the governors, a lot of legislators, they were Klansmen. They're starting to come under scrutiny. And so, today we think of the Ku Klux Klan as basically a domestic terrorist organization. Well, this is where that idea comes from. This is where it starts. The 24th Amendment is passed also in late 1964, and it abolishes a poll tax. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, a poll tax is a series of taxes that when you go to vote, you have to show your ID. And when you show your ID, at the voting place, at the polling place, when you go to vote, they'll check your name against any tax registers. And if you owe any property tax, if you owe any other kind of taxes, they'll say you've got to pay your taxes now before you can vote. They'll hold your vote hostage so you can pay taxes. Well, many of the southern states have taken this one step further and said being able to vote is taxable. And so they'd say, well, for a white person, the poll tax is 50 cents or $1. But for a black person that would come in, okay, your poll tax is $10 or $15 or $20. Incredibly, Florida, as it turns out, about 5 or 6 years ago, tried to reintroduce that. And their governor was told under no uncertain terms that that's unconstitutional. You can't. but they were trying to identify different people, African Americans in particular, as a minority group and put a poll tax on them so they couldn't vote. So this suppression, this mechanism for suppression goes on to this day. 1965, protesters at the Pettus Bridge in the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Now for that, I do recommend that you go down, scroll down a couple, and take a look at the photographs. So Edmund Pettus, as it turns out, was a white supremacist. He was a racist. He was a known racist. This bridge is built in Selma, Alabama, which was a largely African-American town, as a mark of, where the white supremacist movement is watching you. We're controlling you. Here's the symbol of white supremacy in your town. It was deliberately done. So African Americans said, okay, we're going to get now this is key, they got a license for, a parade. And they went out and got the license. They did all the paperwork. They went through all the steps, and they got a license for a parade. And again, if you'll take a look at the photograph, they're not stopping traffic or anything. They're on the pedestrian side of the bridge. And in the photograph that I have down there, there's two figures right in the very front leading this protest march. And the figure in the white coat, you'll see him down there, and I'll point this out when we go to image analysis in a second. That is none other than John Lewis. Now, John Lewis is a congressman today, a very senior congressman. Now, the police are going to move in, and they're going to break up this march. They're going to say, listen, you're impeding traffic, bad things are going on, and we're just going to break up the march. Well, they said, listen, we have a license, and we're not impeding traffic. Well, that gave law enforcement all of the reason they needed to get out the billy sticks and the fire hoses and the horses and just start bashing people up. So when that photograph was taken of these marchers going over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, John Lewis almost got killed that day. He is minutes away from being hit in the face hard with a billy club. There's a big scar over his left eye to this day where he almost got killed. And so, again, the television cameras were there. It's perfectly obvious that it's not the African American community who's acting badly. It's the white community. It's law enforcement. They're acting really, really badly here. They're the ones that are exhibiting this violence. The next one, Malcolm X is assassinated. Now, Malcolm X, he's out on the West Coast. He had been agitating as well. He'd been saying, listen, African Americans out here in California are being treated bad, especially in Los Angeles. Now, this is important. The Los Angeles Police Department was deeply corrupt at the time. And there was a large racist element to the Los Angeles Police Department. The community of Watts was thought of as an African American community, and very, surreptitiously, real estate agents and zoning and all that other were targeting that area and saying, listen, if you're African American, that's the only place where you can buy a home or rent an apartment or open a business. So, again, this wasn't done publicly. California, broadly speaking, did not have any kind of segregationist laws. But that's what was taking place. And the African American community out in the West, out in California, knew that they were being targeted. Well, it's unfortunate, but Malcolm X was a little bit more on the militant side. And his catchphrase was, quote, by any means necessary. He'd also switched to the Islamic faith. Nothing wrong with that. But at the time, 1965, in the 1960s, that was really seen as very, very radical. And there was a lot of antipathy towards the Islamic community. So he got shot. He was at a meeting and he got shot. What's important here, as it is with all these other assassinations that we'll go through in a minute, the investigation was bungled. There were a lot of questions on the investigation. The people that did the shooting, almost got away with it or did get away with it. And then it was clearly shown that the investigation was poorly handled. And the African American community is saying, listen, that's because we're black and we don't get any kind of meaningful, aid from the law. So the immediate outcome of Malcolm X getting assassinated is the very next thing there, which is the Watts riots. Now, again, Watts is a district of Los Angeles, and people took to the streets. Now, this is unfortunate. Because the African American community rioted in their community. You ought not to riot under any circumstances, to be clear. Riots are bad, don't do that. But they rioted in their own community, and there was looting in their own community, and there were things being burned in their own community. And so their community, the African American community in Los Angeles, this Watts district in Los Angeles, was like badly damaged by this. And many of those businesses have never returned because the insurance values are too high. And, it becomes more and more run down. And so if you want to go to the grocery store, you got to go outside of Watts. You've got to commute a long ways. So the area around Watts is really kind of a depressed area, and it just got worse. Now, of course, the ethnic flavor of Watts has changed dramatically since then. It's largely a Hispanic community now. But even today, in broad measure, insurance values there are really, really high. Businesses don't want to go in there. They think it's unsettling. And, that's, almost 50 years has passed. And Watts is still a kind of a depressed area within the greater Los Angeles community. The Voting Rights Act is also passed in 65, and this basically protects the vote for anyone. In other words, poll taxes are gone, and all these other laws that the states were enacting, they are all overturned by federal agency. The federal government is saying, listen, if people want to show up to vote, they just let them vote. Just let them vote. And the South didn't like that one damn bit. They did not like that. 1968, the Civil Rights Act. Again, please take a look at your textbook for that. I just don't have time here to cover that in any kind of meaningful detail. Please take a look at that. But in broad measure, this is affirmative action. It is no discrimination in housing. If you have, if you're getting any kind of federal loan, then an African American, an Hispanic, anybody else of any kind of minority ethnicity, they should be able to live wherever they want. They have a right to get a house, a home, anywhere they want. You may not target ethnicities, ethnic groups, and put them in a zone. There's not a black part of town or a Hispanic part of town or an Islamic part of town or a Jewish part of town. There is a town, and anybody should be able to buy a home anywhere in that town that they want. So there's more to the Civil Rights Act than that. Please take a look at that in your textbook. Affirmative action, this is a continuing program that goes on. Now, it is very, very controversial even to this day. Affirmative action basically says that in federal hiring especially, and in state hiring in many states, not all of them, but many of them, you have to take a look at the census and get the demographic breakdown so that hiring at the federal level or at the state level has to reflect the ethnic makeup of the community. So if a community is 10% or 12% or 15% African American, then the staff in a federal or in many times in a state organization has to be roughly 15% African American. If it's 15 or 12 or 18 or 20% Hispanic, then similarly, federal or state hiring has to create a staff that's 10, 12, 15, 20% Hispanic, and so forth. Now, this is unfortunate because the only way you can do that is you have to have quotas. In other words, the practical application of that is when a job becomes available, you have to canvass the number of people that you have in that organization. Then you have to say, okay, we only have 10 people in our entire organization, and 20% of the population, the local population, is Hispanic or African American. That means we have to have 2 Hispanic or African American people on staff. Ladies and gentlemen, this is unfortunate, but that may mean that the person that gets hired for the job is not the most qualified. In other words, you're not hiring the most qualified person regardless of race or ethnicity or sex or anything else. You're hiring somebody to fulfill a quota. And that is unfortunate. Now, lately, especially in the last, 15 or 20 years, that's led to some lawsuits from white people saying, listen, I was the most qualified, but I didn't get the job because I'm white. And an African American or Hispanic person got that job. Now, that doesn't happen as much more as it did, 15 or 10 or 15 years ago, but those cases do still come up. However, the underlying cause of this is that it's to right a past wrong. In other words, here are all these things that, all this discrimination has been going against African Americans and laterally Hispanic Americans. And so we need to even up the playing field. We need to even up the score. Now, a few years ago, some of the southern states got rid of their affirmative action laws. They got rid of that. And the federal government kind of allowed them to okay, we're going to keep an eye on you. The Supreme Court kind of said that. We're going to allow you to get rid of these affirmative action laws, but we're just going to keep an eye on it, monitor it. And sure enough, within a few years, in these southern states in particular, the staffs in federal and state and local government activities, sure enough, they went 80, 90, 99, 90, 100% white. So this idea of discrimination is still out there. Now, they were justifying it by saying, well, listen, these white people have the best credentials. They have the best, they've got the best qualifications. But it's impossible to really justify that by saying, with our education system as it is today, it's impossible to say that a white person, that all white people have better credentials than any black or Hispanic person. That's just impossible to say. So no matter what, it just seems like that this sort of racist business still is going on, and it's genuinely unfortunate. 1968, Martin Luther King is killed in Memphis, Tennessee. The story goes, or the narrative is, he was in with Jesse Jackson and some of these other civil rights leaders. They were having a strategy about what they're going to do next and how things are going to work out and what their next steps are. Now, Martin Luther King did not smoke cigarettes, but everybody else did. And so there they are in this closed-in hotel room, and he said, listen, I'm going to step out and get a breath of fresh air because you guys got this place, smoked up. And so he stepped up onto the second floor. That's where they had the room out. And he stepped out on the balcony, and bang, he was assassinated. Now, the assassin was a guy named James Earl Ray. James Earl Ray was accused of the assassination. So here is kind of the problem. The problem was that Martin Luther King was under FBI investigation. They were watching him everywhere he went. Plus, he was under local police surveillance. They were watching him everywhere he went. They knew where he was at. But when they called the police and said, listen, this man's been shot, it took like 20 minutes for the cops to get there. It didn't take long for the reporters to get there. There are photographs of this. Martin Luther King is laying there in a pool of blood. And all the other civil rights leaders are pointing. They're saying, listen, the shot came from over there. Well, then it took a couple of more minutes for law enforcement to get in their cars, drive right immediately around the corner, and start looking for the possible shooter. Well, this gave the possible shooter plenty of time to get into a vehicle and just quietly drive away, which is exactly what happened. So what I'm driving at is that the investigation was bungled immediately. And there's significant questions, even for me, and I am not a conspiracy theory person at all. I don't agree with that sort of thing, that James Earl Ray was not working alone. There's considerable room for that idea, especially since a few years ago, part of that area there it had been covered with a lot of decorative brush. There was a lot of decorative plants there, vines and like that. Well, the people that were pointing at where the shot came from said, no, it's not from the other building. It's from those bushes right there. Well, when law enforcement investigated, they didn't go to the bushes. They went to this building in behind. A few years ago, there was a sort of a fire, or they changed up the this decorative brushwork or whatever it was, this architecture, and sure enough, they found a spent shell casing right where they said, hey, that's where the shot came from. Now, the shell casing had been laying there in the dirt for all of these years, and so there was no really way to, correlate that with the weapon that was supposed to have killed Martin Luther King. But what was a bullet, a rifle bullet, doing up there in that brushwork, right where those guys have been pointing? So there is considerable, justification for a little bit of. Now, James Earl Ray, he was put in prison for that. He spent the rest of his life in jail for that. And so somebody went down for that crime. Good. June 5th, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. Now, real quickly here, Robert F. Kennedy was running for president, and he was going to win. He was running for president, and he was going to win. So he's on a campaign trail. He was young, handsome. He was dynamic. He'd been the Attorney General for the United States. There was still a lot of very fond memories of his older brother, John F. Kennedy. And so Robert F. Kennedy was going to win. He was going to win. Very famously, he was in an auditorium and gave a speech. The speech was over. He's kind of in a hurry. He goes back into the reception in behind the auditorium there. And, shots rang out. Bang, bang, bang. Well, he's shot by a guy named Sirhan Sirhan, Sirhan dash Sirhan, who evidently, as I am recording this, is still alive and in jail in California, and he'll never get out. The problem with the investigation was, how did this otherwise unknown individual get that close to Robert F. Kennedy? Second, how did this otherwise unknown individual get that close to Robert F. Kennedy with a gun? Finally, when the investigation was ongoing, everybody's taken out of the way and law enforcement is there taking a look at the place. Evidently, there were bullet holes everywhere. There were all sorts of bullet holes. They were in the door sills. They were in the ceiling. There were bullet holes all over the place. So when RFK got shot, it must have been a damn shooting gallery. Well, what's this all about? So again, I'm not a conspiracy theory person at all. Sirhan Sirhan went to jail for the crime. But the investigation was bungled. There are a lot of open questions to the investigation. So when we take a look at the 1960s as a decade of turmoil, think of Malcolm X being assassinated, and there's considerable question about that. Think of MLK being assassinated, and there's a lot of questions about that. Think of Medgar Evers being murdered right on the front doorstep of his home, and there's a lot of questions about the actual murder. And then Robert F. Kennedy is assassinated, and there are all of these open-ended questions about that assassination. And so not only is this a part of civil rights, because all the people that I've described here are all civil rights individuals, and now they're all dead. But there's considerable question about the investigations into their murders. So this is all about 1960s as a decade of turmoil. And it's all about, the change that took about because of the civil rights movement. So I have continuing reaction to the Deep South to this very day, which is true. Now, recently, there's a politician in either Louisiana or Mississippi, I think Mississippi, and he's a Republican. His name's Haley Barbour. And Haley Barbour, a very significant individual in the Republican Party. And he keeps talking out against this sort of thing. He keeps saying that the South is trying to get away from that, and that is true. But this is pernicious, this reaction against African Americans. And now Hispanics, more and more and more against Hispanics. And so this still goes on in the South. All right, well, that ties up everything that I have to say about the actual civil rights movement. Again, this is just a brief overview that, as I'm saying this, is 1 hour and 24 minutes into the presentation. But let me go on to the next couple of slides. It'll just take a couple of minutes on each one of these slides and just do a little bit of image analysis. So let's proceed. So here is the Little Rock Nine. Again, when we take a look at these young people, they're trying to go to Little Rock High School. And I want you guys to use your powers of image analysis. What is it about these young people that is, that makes them the monster, that makes them the bad people? They're clean cut. They're dressed like any other high schools. One of these young ladies is wearing a little poodle skirt. He's got bobby socks on. I mean, how much more clean cut can you be? Button-down shirts, slacks. They're well dressed, and all they want is an education. The only thing that's keeping them from going to Little Rock High School is the fact that they're black. So going clockwise from the upper left, you'll see that they are very clean cut. They're wearing ordinary clothes that you would expect back in the 1950s, 1960s. The next one over, again, this is, I believe the photographer got a Pulitzer Prize for this photograph. And you can see this young lady, all she's trying to do is just get out of school and go home. School is over with. She's got her notebooks and she just wants to go home. And you see this horrifying woman in the background shouting and screaming. And other people that are there, and they're just looking at this, the white population there, they're looking on with this, this anger. Continue on to the next photograph down the bottom. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what the 82nd Airborne escorting these children to school looks like. Rifles with fixed bayonets, highly spit-shine shoes, pistol belts with ammunition, and they have to tell these students, these 15, 16-year-old students, okay, get inside this formation and we'll march you in. And so the last photograph there on the lower left, what do these kids want? Exactly what they got, a high school diploma. That's all they wanted. And shouldn't any student have a right to get that without having to go through unmitigated hell? And that's what the civil rights is all about. Here are citizens of the United States who just want the same thing that anybody else wants. They don't want anything special. So with that sort of thing, a little bit of image analysis, let's go on to the next. Now here is Martin Luther King. There he is, that photograph in the upper right. That is him. That's his mugshot. That little line that goes around his neck, it has his, his prisoner number on there. That's his mugshot on the day that he was arrested for public assembly, essentially, in Birmingham, in Birmingham County, in Birmingham, Alabama. So in the lower left, you see that's the jail cell he was in. And he talked about this. He said it stank. It was nasty. The lighting was like really, really poor. It was really, well, you can just see it for yourself. Really a bad place to be in. The other two photographs you see there on the upper left and the lower right, that is him. He's gotten out just some, odds and ends stationery that I happen to have on him. And he wrote out this amazing letter of this amazing, American prose, this tremendous statement about what the civil rights movement is all about, directed at the religious community, who, in principle, should be with him. They should be on his side. So, really, the last slide is next. Let's take a look at, this slide is next to the last. This is Rosa Parks. There she is. That's her mugshot. Evidently, her prisoner number is 7053. She's been arrested. She's on her way home from work. There's the booking photograph. The officer's like, okay, put your fingerprints here. Kind of the lower left, that's the bus that she was, the bus that she was seated at. And again, the bus driver would come along and say, listen, you got to move to the back of the bus if there's more white people. Now, that one is kind of a staged shot, and the bus itself is actually in a museum. But what I want to draw your attention to is, she's just an ordinary citizen of the United States. All she wants to do is go home, fix a meal for her husband and her kids. That's it. Nothing special. She's not an agitator. She's not out there throwing stones. She's just going home from work and got arrested. And what was the reason why? She wouldn't give up her seat for a white man. It's pernicious, ladies and gentlemen. That's what I mean. So she's got to go through the entire booking process. She's got to get a lawyer to get bailed out. Her husband has to come down there and pick her up from jail. You know, how did that look to her kids? And so when we talk about Rosa Parks as an icon, that was not her goal. That was not her goal. And in my view, that makes her, all the more heroic, that she's going to do something, stand up for her basic rights with no other goal in mind than, I'm exhausted, I'm tired, and I'm not going to move. That was it. So I have a photo montage next. Now, clockwise from upper left, I have it up there. There's Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin. That's Bayard Rustin. I think he lived until the late 70s, early 80s. I'm not too sure on that. Again, he's a civil rights activist going all the way back to the 1930s. Again, he had to stay behind the scenes because he was homosexual, he was gay, but he knew everybody. He's an amazing organizer. He understood how the system worked. He's one of these people that are insisting on peace, on not getting out there with any kind of violence, and he's guiding Martin Luther King. Now, I don't mean to suggest that Bayard Rustin is telling Martin Luther King what to do. MLK knew what to do. He had strength of character. He could do that. But when you think of Bayard Rustin, understand that he's an organizer. He's an administrative guy. And again, he sacrificed public persona for the movement. He had to stay behind the scenes. The upper right, that is the photographs of these men who were murdered in Mississippi burning. And one of these Klansmen famously said, we killed a Jew, a N-word, and a white man. And so, even in the investigative side, it was like really, really horrible what happened to these young people. And all they're trying to do is say, listen, you can't identify African Americans as a minority group and just systematically stick it to them. You can't. The bottom right, that guy in the white jacket there, that is John Lewis. Again, he is a respected congressman to this very day. He's been in Congress for, I think, over 40 years now. He gets reelected, and he will continue to get reelected as long as he wants to run. And as you can see, they're not obstructing traffic. They are not. Law enforcement is in the foreground with a crash helmet on, and just after this photograph was taken, they're going to tell these people to disperse. They're going to say, listen, we have a parade license, here it all is. We're not creating a ruckus. We're just walking across the footpath across the bridge. And so law enforcement just unloaded, and they started beating these people half to death. John Lewis almost died that day, minutes after this photograph was taken. Last but not least, in the lower left, here are four of these young ladies. There were 14 others that are badly injured. But these young ladies lost their lives. And the only reason that they were murdered in a firebombing in a church is that they're black. That's the only reason. That's it. Just because the Klan hates black people. And so they were murdered. Now, why on earth would anybody want to kill these precious little girls? It serves no purpose. And again, many of the guys that were directly, personally involved in this, they got away with it. The only reason why there was any sort of accusation and trial is because the Attorney General of the United States was watching, and the prosecuting attorney knew that. But he rigged it so most of the guys that were directly involved in this got away with it. They got away. So hopefully you guys understand what was really going on back in those days. This is the horrible things that were going on back in those days. And this is just kind of a brief overview. I'm not trying to get on any kind of a soapbox here. I'm not. It may have sounded like that, but I'm passionately opposed to identifying Americans as a minority group and taking their rights away. You can't do that. Yes? So thank you for your attention on this. I hope you enjoyed this brief overview of the civil rights. And remember that every bit of this is testable, so I will see you guys on the final.